To understand the samurai, we must first journey back to the 8th and 9th centuries, to a Japan that would scarcely be recognizable to those who would later witness the samurai at their height. The Nara period, lasting from 710 to 794, represented a time when Japanese society looked eagerly toward China for inspiration. The Tang dynasty's influence permeated every aspect of Japanese culture, from governmental structure to Buddhist philosophy. The Japanese imperial court, centered in Nara and later in Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, maintained elaborate ceremonies and rituals that mirrored Chinese practices. During this era, the emperor stood as the supreme authority, though even then his power was beginning to show signs of erosion. The true wielders of influence were the aristocratic families, particularly the Fujiwara clan, who through strategic marriages and political maneuvering had essentially captured control of the imperial court by the mid-9th century. These nobles lived lives of exquisite refinement, composing poetry, practicing calligraphy, and engaging in the subtle arts of courtly intrigue. The notion that warriors might one day supplant them in power would have seemed utterly absurd. The military system of early Japan reflected Chinese models. The government maintained a conscript army drawn from the peasant population, with each male of appropriate age required to serve. This force was organized into provincial militias under the command of government-appointed officials. The system, known as the gundan, relied on farmers who would set aside their agricultural implements to take up arms when needed. These peasant soldiers received minimal training and were equipped with basic weapons. The bow served as the primary weapon of distance combat, while close fighting involved swords and spears of varying quality. However, this system contained inherent weaknesses that would eventually necessitate its transformation. The peasant conscripts, torn from their fields, often proved reluctant warriors with little martial skill. The distances involved in assembling these forces from across Japan's mountainous terrain created logistical nightmares. Most critically, the central government's authority was strongest near the capital, and weakened considerably as one travelled to the distant provinces. In the outer regions, particularly in the northern and eastern territories, a different reality was taking shape. Here, where the imperial court's influence barely reached, local landowners faced constant threats from bandits, rival families, and in the far north, from the Emishi people, who resisted Japanese expansion. These landowners began to hire their own warriors for protection, men who would fight not out of obligation to the state, but in exchange for payment or land rights. These early warriors came from diverse backgrounds. Some were lower-ranking nobles who had left the capital seeking opportunity in the provinces. Others were the younger sons of aristocratic families who, lacking inheritance prospects, turned to martial service. Still others emerged from local families who had acquired wealth through land management and trade. What united them was their dedication to martial training and their willingness to fight for whoever would pay them or grant them land. The year 792 marked a pivotal turning point. The imperial government, recognizing the inefficiency of the conscript system, formally abolished the provincial militias. This decision, intended to reduce administrative burden and allow peasants to focus on agricultural production, inadvertently created a power vacuum in the provinces. With no official military force to maintain order, local landowners had no choice but to rely increasingly on private armies of professional warriors. These warriors began to develop distinctive characteristics that would eventually define the samurai class. They trained constantly in horseback riding and archery, the two skills most essential for warfare in the Japanese landscape. A warrior's horse became his most valued possession after his weapons, and the ability to shoot arrows accurately while galloping across uneven terrain represented the pinnacle of martial skill. They also practiced with the sword, though in these early days it served primarily as a secondary weapon or for collecting the heads of defeated enemies, which served as proof of one's achievements in battle. The bond between these warriors and their employers began to take on quasi-feudal characteristics. A landowner who provided military service could expect to receive not just immediate payment, but also protection and patronage. In return, the warrior pledged loyalty and service. These relationships were personal and binding, based on mutual benefit and maintained through elaborate gift-giving and ceremonies that reinforced the connection between patron and retainer. As the 9th century progressed into the 10th, certain families began to emerge as dominant military powers in various regions. In the eastern provinces, the Minamoto clan gradually accumulated both military prowess and political connections to the imperial court. In the west, the Taira family similarly rose to prominence. These families didn't yet call themselves samurai, a term that wouldn't enter common usage for some time, but they were creating the foundations upon which the samurai class would be built. The development of these warrior bands coincided with increasing disorder in the provinces. The 10th century witnessed several major uprisings that revealed both the weakness of central authority and the growing power of military families. In 939, a warrior named Taira no Masakado, operating in the eastern provinces, launched a rebellion that shook the imperial court. Masakado had considerable forces under his command, described in chronicles as leading many thousands of warriors. His rebellion, though eventually suppressed, demonstrated that organized military power in the provinces could challenge the authority of the court itself. These early warrior bands operated according to principles that would later be formalized into the samurai code. Reputation and honor already mattered greatly. A warrior's worth was measured by his skill in battle, the quality of his equipment, particularly his armor and weapons, and most importantly by his ability to collect the heads of noteworthy enemies. After battles, elaborate ceremonies would take place where heads were displayed, identified, and presented to the victorious leader. This macabre practice served multiple purposes. It provided proof of victories, intimidated potential enemies, and allowed warriors to claim credit for their achievements. The armor of these early warriors consisted of small iron or leather plates laced together with silk cords, creating flexible protection that could withstand arrows and sword strikes, while allowing freedom of movement. The designs drew inspiration from continental Asian armor, but adapted to Japanese materials and fighting styles. A warrior's armor wasn't merely protective equipment, but a display of wealth and status. The quality of the lacquer, the color of the silk cords, and the design of the helmet all communicated information about the wearer's resources and position. Religious and philosophical influences were already shaping warrior culture. Buddhism, which had arrived in Japan centuries earlier, provided frameworks for understanding violence and death. Certain Buddhist sects emphasized the transient nature of life and the importance of maintaining mental clarity in the face of danger. Shinto, Japan's native religion, contributed concepts of purification and the divine nature of the Japanese islands. Confucian ideas about loyalty, hierarchy, and proper conduct filtered in from China. These diverse philosophical streams would eventually merge into the distinctive ethical system known as bushido, though that formal codification lay centuries in the future. The relationship between these provincial warriors and the imperial court remained complex and evolving. The court still represented the source of legitimate authority and cultural refinement. Warriors who could claim descent from imperial lines or connection to court nobility enjoyed higher status than those without such lineage. Many warrior families traced their ancestry, real or fabricated, back to imperial princes who had been sent to the provinces in earlier centuries. This connection to the court provided legitimacy to their military power, while simultaneously revealing the distance between the refined world of Heian aristocracy and the rough violence of provincial warfare. As the 10th century drew to a close, the stage was set for the emergence of the samurai as a defined class. The elements were all in place: professional warriors loyal to powerful families, a central government unable to project military force into the provinces, and increasing competition between regional powers seeking to expand their influence. The next 2 centuries would see these elements coalesce into a warrior class that would eventually supplant the aristocracy as Japan's ruling elite. The Heian period, lasting from 794 to 1185, takes its name from Heian Kyo, the capital city that would become modern Kyoto. This era witnessed the height of Japanese courtly culture, producing magnificent works of literature like The Tale of Genji, refined artistic traditions and elaborate court ceremonies. Yet beneath this glittering surface, profound changes were reshaping Japanese society. changes that would give rise to the samurai as a distinct and increasingly powerful class. The Fujiwara family's dominance of the imperial court reached its zenith during the early and middle Heian period. Through a sophisticated system of marriage politics, the Fujiwara ensured that imperial consorts came almost exclusively from their ranks, making them the grandfathers and uncles of emperors. This position allowed them to rule as regents, wielding imperial authority without officially holding the throne. Their focus on courtly intrigue and cultural refinement, however, meant they paid little attention to military matters or provincial administration. This neglect created opportunities for the growth of warrior power. The system of land ownership in Heian Japan was extraordinarily complex. Officially, all land belonged to the emperor and was distributed to farmers who paid taxes on their production. In reality, large estates known as shun had developed, controlled by aristocratic families, Buddhist temples, and other powerful institutions. These estates often enjoyed tax exemptions and varying degrees of autonomy from central government control. The management of these shun required armed force. Estate managers needed to protect crops from bandits, enforce control over resident farmers, and defend boundaries against encroaching neighbors. This created steady demand for warrior services. Families specializing in military affairs found themselves employed not only by provincial landowners, but also by the great aristocratic houses in the capital, who needed armed retainers to protect their interests in distant estates. The term samurai gradually came into use during this period. Derived from the verb saburo, meaning to serve or to attend upon, it originally referred to those who attended upon nobles, regardless of their military function. Over time, however, the term became increasingly associated with armed retainers. The earlier, more generic term bushi, meaning simply warrior, continued in use and in fact remained the more formal designation for the warrior class throughout subsequent centuries. The 11th century saw the crystallization of two great warrior clans that would dominate the next several generations, the Minamoto and the Taira. Both claimed descent from imperial princes who had been given clan names and sent to the provinces in earlier centuries. This imperial lineage, even though it stretched back several generations, gave both families a legitimacy that pure provincial warriors lacked. They were, in a sense, fallen nobility who had found new paths to power through military prowess rather than court politics. The Taira clan established its base primarily in western Japan, with particularly strong influence around the inland sea. They developed expertise in naval warfare and maritime affairs, which would serve them well in the conflicts to come. The clan built relationships with court nobles and gradually accumulated positions within the provincial administration. Taira warriors served as guards at the imperial palace, as governors of provinces, and as military troubleshooters dispatched to deal with disorder in various regions. The Minamoto clan, by contrast, focused their power in the eastern provinces, the Kanto region around modern Tokyo. This area, far from the capital, had always been somewhat independent and frontier-like. The Minamoto cultivated extensive networks of warrior families throughout the east, creating what amounted to a shadow military organization that paralleled but remained outside official governmental structure. Their distance from court politics initially appeared to be a disadvantage, but would ultimately prove a source of strength. Throughout the 11th century, these warrior families increasingly inserted themselves into the political conflicts of the court. When aristocratic factions quarrelled, they turned to warrior clans for military support. This involvement in court politics represented a significant evolution from the earlier role of warriors as mere provincial peacekeepers. They were becoming power brokers in their own right. The middle and late Heian period witnessed numerous armed conflicts that demonstrated the growing importance of warrior power. The Hogan Rebellion of 1156 erupted from a dispute over imperial succession. The retired Emperor Sutoku sought to reclaim power from Emperor Go-Shirakawa, and both sides recruited warrior support. The Taira, led by Taira no Kiyomori, sided with Go-Shirakawa, as did some branches of the Minamoto. The conflict, though brief, resulted in unprecedented violence in the capital itself, with warrior bands fighting in the streets of Kyoto. The victorious Taira emerged from this conflict with enhanced prestige and closer ties to the imperial court. Just 3 years later, the Heiji Rebellion of 1159 further accelerated the rise of warrior power. This conflict again involved court factions, with different branches of the Fujiwara family competing for influence. The Taira under Kiyomori once more demonstrated their military effectiveness, defeating their Minamoto rivals and killing several prominent Minamoto leaders. The young Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would later found the first shogunate, barely escaped execution, being exiled to the provinces instead, a decision that would have momentous consequences. These rebellions marked a turning point. The imperial court had demonstrated its complete dependence on warrior clans for military force. The traditional aristocracy, for all their cultural refinement and administrative skill, possessed no ability to defend themselves or project power through violence. This realization fundamentally altered the balance of power in Japanese society. Taira no Kiyomori exploited his military victories to insert his family into the highest levels of court politics. He arranged marriages between his daughters and imperial princes, eventually making his grandson an emperor. He accumulated court ranks and positions, becoming the first warrior to achieve the position of chancellor. The Taira controlled numerous provinces as governors, accumulated vast estates, and dominated trade in the inland sea. For a brief period, it appeared that the Taira might successfully merge warrior power with traditional aristocratic authority, creating a new synthesis. However, Kiyomori's success contained the seeds of his family's destruction. His accumulation of power and wealth generated resentment among traditional court nobles, who saw themselves displaced by what they considered provincial upstarts. More dangerously, other warrior families viewed the Taira's dominance with alarm and jealousy. The Minamoto, in particular, nursed grievances over their defeats and losses. They continued to build their network of warrior supporters in the eastern provinces, biding their time. The training and culture of warriors during the Heian period became increasingly formalized and distinctive. Young men born into warrior families began their martial education early, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old. They learned horsemanship, essential for a warrior's effectiveness in battle. Japanese horses were smaller than their continental cousins, but hardy and well suited to the mountainous terrain. A warrior would spend countless hours practicing mounted archery, shooting at targets while riding at full gallop. The bow and arrow remained the primary weapons of warfare throughout the Heian period. Japanese bows were asymmetric, with the grip positioned about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom. This design, unique to Japan, allowed for effective shooting from horseback. Warriors would carry multiple arrows, some with specialized heads for different purposes. Armor-piercing arrows had narrow heads designed to penetrate metal plates. Whistling arrows created psychological effects, and fire arrows could ignite thatched roofs. Close combat skills, while considered secondary to archery, still received attention. The sword, which would later become the symbol of the samurai, was used primarily in close quarters when archery became impractical. Swordsmiths had already begun developing the curved blade design that would characterize Japanese swords. The curve allowed for more effective drawing and cutting motions when on horseback. The process of sword making involved repeatedly folding steel to create strong, flexible blades with distinctive grain patterns. Warrior ethics during the Heian period, while not yet formally codified, already emphasized certain key values. Personal honor and reputation mattered immensely. A warrior's name, his family lineage, and his battlefield achievements defined his worth. Before engaging in combat, warriors would announce their names, ancestry, and notable deeds, a practice that seemed strange to modern sensibilities, but served important functions in a society where personal reputation was everything. Loyalty to one's lord represented another crucial value, though the nature of this loyalty differed from later periods. Heian warriors certainly expected rewards for their service land grants, offices, positions, and were willing to change allegiances if their current lord failed to provide adequately. The relationship was more transactional than the absolute unconditional loyalty that later samurai ideology would celebrate. Nevertheless, betraying a lord who had treated one well was considered deeply dishonorable. The practice of collecting enemy heads after battle became highly ritualized. After a conflict, warriors would present the heads of enemies they had killed to their commanders. Elaborate ceremonies developed around this practice, with heads being washed, made up with cosmetics, and arranged on display platforms, officials would identify the deceased, and credit would be assigned to the warrior who had taken each head. This might seem grotesque, but in the context of the time, it served as the primary means of documenting battlefield achievements and determining rewards. By the late 12th century, tensions between the Taira and their rivals had reached a breaking point. The Taira's dominance at court, their wealth, and their political power generated increasing resentment. In 1180, this tension exploded into open warfare with the beginning of the Genpei War, named after alternative readings of the Chinese characters for Minamoto, Gen, and Taira, Hei. This 5-year conflict would transform Japan, destroy the Taira, establish the Minamoto as supreme, and inaugurate the Age of Warrior rule. The war began when Prince Mochihito, a claimant to the imperial throne, called upon the Minamoto to rise against Taira dominance. Although the prince was quickly defeated and killed, his call galvanized Minamoto warriors throughout the country. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now in his 30s and hardened by years of exile, rallied warriors in the eastern provinces. His younger brother Yoshitsune, a military genius, would lead Minamoto forces in several decisive battles. The Genpei War ravaged Japan from Kyushu in the south to the northern provinces. Battles raged across mountains, through forests, and along coastlines. The Minamoto's deep network of warrior alliances in the east gave them a vast reservoir of military manpower. The Taira, despite their control of the court and western territories, found themselves gradually losing ground. Their forces were defeated in a series of major engagements, and they were forced to flee the capital with the child emperor, who was their grandson. The war's conclusion came in 1185 at the Battle of Dan no Ura, a naval engagement in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu. The Minamoto fleet, aided by defections from former Taira allies, overwhelmed the Taira vessels. In the aftermath of defeat rather than face capture, many Taira warriors and their families committed suicide by drowning. The child emperor Antoku, barely 7 years old, was taken into the sea by his grandmother. The Taira clan, so dominant just 2 decades earlier, was effectively destroyed. Minamoto no Yoritomo had emerged victorious, but his triumph was not merely military. He had fundamentally altered the structure of Japanese governance. Rather than following the Taira example of trying to merge warrior power with traditional court politics, Yoritomo chose to create a parallel government structure. In 1192, he received from the emperor the title of shogun, or barbarian subduing general, an ancient military commission that Yoritomo transformed into something new, the basis for a warrior government that would operate separately from the court. This moment marks the true beginning of the samurai age. Warriors were no longer merely servants of the aristocracy or participants in court politics. They had become rulers in their own right, establishing a military government that would, with various interruptions and transformations, last for nearly 700 years. The refined culture of the Heian court would continue, but real power had shifted permanently to the warrior class. Minamoto no Yoritomo's establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in 1192 represented a revolutionary reorganization of Japanese political structure. Rather than ruling from Kyoto, the traditional center of imperial power, Yoritomo established his headquarters in Kamakura, a small coastal town in the Kanto region, far from the intrigues and distractions of the capital. This geographical separation symbolized the fundamental divide between the emperor's court, which retained ceremonial and cultural authority, and the shogun's government, which wielded actual political and military power. The system Yoritomo created was elegant in its simplicity, yet flexible enough to endure for well over a century. At its core lay the relationship between the shogun and his housemen, called gokunin. These warrior retainers pledged absolute loyalty to the shogun in exchange for protection and the confirmation of their land rights. The shogun appointed military governors called shugo to each province. These governors maintained order, commanded warriors in times of conflict, and served as the shogun's representatives in their assigned territories. Alongside the shugo system, the shogunate established estate stewards called jito to manage confiscated or disputed lands. These stewards, always warriors loyal to the shogun, collected taxes and maintained security on their assigned estates. Together, the Shugo and Jito created a parallel administrative structure that operated alongside and increasingly overshadowed the traditional provincial governance system of the imperial court. Yoritomo proved as effective a political organizer as he was a military leader. He carefully managed the relationships between his warrior retainers, mediating disputes and ensuring that loyal service received appropriate rewards. He created legal procedures for warriors to settle land disputes and inheritance questions, giving his government practical relevance to the daily concerns of the warrior class. This judicial function proved crucial in building loyalty to the Kamakura system. However, Yoritomo's direct line would not long survive him. He died in 1199 under mysterious circumstances, possibly from a fall from his horse. His sons proved weak and were eventually eliminated, leading to the bizarre situation where the Hojo family, who had intermarried with the Minamoto, ruled as regents for shoguns who were themselves figureheads. The emperor remained a ceremonial figure, the shogun had nominal military authority, but the Hojo regents wielded actual power. This complex layering of authority would characterize much of Japanese political history. Despite these leadership complexities, the Kamakura period saw the full flowering of samurai culture as a distinct way of life. The warriors of this era developed an increasingly sophisticated sense of themselves as a class, apart from both the old aristocracy and the common people. This self-identity combined martial values with a growing appreciation for discipline, loyalty, and what would later be called bushido. Zen Buddhism found particularly fertile ground among the Kamakura samurai. This sect of Buddhism, newly arrived from China, emphasized meditation, direct experience of enlightenment, and a stripped-down simplicity that appealed to warriors. Zen's emphasis on mental discipline, its teaching that enlightenment could come in a sudden flash during any activity including combat, and its general philosophical approach to death resonated with the samurai experience. Major Zen temples became important cultural centers under warrior patronage. The relationship between Zen and the sword became particularly significant. Swordsmanship, which had previously been viewed purely as a practical combat skill, began to be understood as a path to spiritual development. The mental clarity required for effective sword work, the necessity of acting without hesitation or fear, the direct confrontation with mortality, all these aligned with Zen teachings. Master swordsmen increasingly saw their art as a form of moving meditation. The 13th century brought a crisis that would test the Kamakura system to its limits and ultimately demonstrate both its strengths and weaknesses. In 1268, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and ruler of the vast Mongol Empire that stretched from China to Eastern Europe, sent envoys to Japan demanding submission and tribute. The Mongols had recently conquered China, establishing the Yuan dynasty, and viewed Japan as the next target for their expansion. The Japanese government, both the court in Kyoto and the shogunate in Kamakura, rejected these demands with contempt. The Mongols, they believed, were barbarians whose threats need not be taken seriously. This proved to be a grave miscalculation. In 1274, a Mongol invasion force of approximately 30,000 troops, including both Mongol and Chinese soldiers, sailed from Korea toward Kyushu, the southernmost main island of Japan. The invasion fleet landed at Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu in November 1274. The samurai defenders, drawn from local warrior families and commanded by the Kamakura-appointed Shugo, rushed to meet the invaders. What followed was unlike anything the Japanese had experienced. The Mongol forces fought as disciplined units using massed formations, explosive projectiles, launched from siege engines and poison-tipped arrows. Their tactics emphasized coordination and overwhelming force rather than individual combat. The Japanese, by contrast, fought in their traditional manner. Samurai would ride forward, announce their names and lineage, and seek individual combat with worthy opponents. This approach, perfectly suited to battles between Japanese warriors where honor and reputation mattered greatly, proved dangerously ineffective against an enemy who cared nothing for such niceties and simply surrounded isolated warriors with groups of soldiers. Despite their disadvantages in tactics and weapons, the Japanese fought with desperate courage. The samurai's superior close combat skills and their intimate knowledge of the local terrain helped offset the Mongols' advantages. The battle raged for a day, with heavy casualties on both sides. That night, the Mongol commanders, concerned about weather conditions and the fierce resistance they had encountered, ordered their fleet to withdraw. During the night, a severe storm struck, destroying or damaging many of the Mongol vessels and drowning thousands of soldiers. The invasion had failed. The Japanese interpreted this deliverance as divine intervention. The storm became known as a kamikaze, a divine wind sent by the gods to protect Japan. This notion of divine protection for the sacred islands would have profound and ultimately tragic consequences centuries later during World War II, when suicide pilots would be called kamikaze in reference to this medieval storm. Kublai Khan, however, was not deterred by one failure. He spent the next several years preparing a much larger invasion force, while sending repeated diplomatic missions demanding Japanese submission, all of which were ignored or resulted in the execution of the Mongol envoys. In 1281, the Mongols launched their second invasion attempt, this time with a massive fleet carrying perhaps 140,000 troops, an enormous force by medieval standards. The Japanese had used the 7-year interval to prepare. The Kamakura government ordered the construction of a stone wall along the coast at Hakata Bay, creating a defensive barrier that would hinder amphibious landings. They assembled the largest concentration of samurai forces yet seen in Japanese history, drawing warriors from across Kyushu and western Honshu. The Japanese also learned from their first encounter, developing tactics better suited to fighting the Mongols' massed formations. When the Mongol fleet arrived in June 1281, it found itself unable to land easily due to the defensive wall. For weeks, fighting raged in brutal ship-to-ship combat and in attempts to establish beachheads. The Japanese employed small, fast boats to raid the larger Mongol vessels at night. Samurai who boarded enemy ships engaged in fierce close-quarters combat, where their superior individual fighting skills provided advantage. The stalemate continued through July and into August. Then, in mid-August, another massive typhoon struck the area. This storm proved even more devastating than the one 7 years earlier. The Mongol fleet, crowded together in the confined waters of the bay and consisting of many hastily constructed vessels, suffered catastrophic losses. Sources estimate that more than half of the invasion force perished, either drowning when their ships sank or being killed by Japanese forces as they struggled to shore. The second divine wind had saved Japan. The Mongol Empire, facing troubles elsewhere and ultimately concluding that Japan was not worth the cost, never attempted a third invasion. The islands had been preserved, but the cost to the Japanese government proved severe. The warriors who had defended against the invasions expected rewards for their service, yet there were no conquered Mongol lands to distribute, no captured wealth to share. The financial strain of maintaining defense preparedness for years eroded the shogunate's economic foundation. The Mongol invasions had several lasting effects on samurai culture and military practice. The experience of fighting a foreign enemy united Japanese warriors in a way that internal conflicts had not. Regional rivalries seemed less important when facing an external threat. The invasions also accelerated changes in military tactics and organization. The lessons learned about massed infantry tactics, group coordination, and combined arms would influence Japanese warfare in subsequent centuries. The late Kamakura period saw increasing economic troubles that undermined the loyalty bonds between the shogunate and warrior families. The division of family estates among multiple heirs, a traditional Japanese practice, led to ever smaller landholdings that couldn't support a warrior's lifestyle. Many warriors fell into debt, particularly after the financial strains of the Mongol defense preparations. The shogunate attempted various reforms to address these problems, but with limited success. Culturally, the Kamakura period witnessed important developments in samurai ideology and practice. The concept of the warrior's path, though not yet called bushido, became more clearly articulated. Historical chronicles from this period, such as the Heike Monogatari, Tales of the Heike, glorified warrior virtues while also noting the transience of worldly power and glory. These war tales, recited by blind monks accompanied by baiwa, a type of lute, spread samurai culture throughout Japanese society. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, became more common and formalized during the Kamakura period. Warriors defeated in battle might commit seppuku to avoid the shame of capture. Those who had failed their lords or committed serious errors might restore their honor through this painful death. The act was not merely about ending one's life, but about demonstrating courage and control even at the moment of death. A warrior would slice his abdomen with a short sword, and a trusted companion would then decapitate him to end his suffering quickly. Family lineages and genealogies acquired increasing importance. Samurai families carefully documented their ancestries, real or fabricated, to establish their claims to status and land rights. Family crests called mon served as important identifiers in battle and peace. These heraldic symbols, simpler than European coats of arms but serving similar functions, appeared on flags, armor, and clothing, immediately communicating a warrior's affiliation. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate faced multiple crises. The Hojo regents, who had ruled effectively for generations, now struggled with internal succession disputes. The economic problems afflicting warrior families had not been solved. Perhaps most dangerous, Emperor Go-Daigo, unlike his passive predecessors, actively sought to restore real political power to the imperial throne. In 1331, Go-Daigo was exiled after a failed attempt to overthrow the shogunate, but 3 years later he escaped exile and tried again. This time, the emperor found allies among powerful warrior families disaffected with Hojo rule. Most crucially, Ashikaga Takauji, a prominent warrior of Minamoto descent who had been sent to suppress the imperial forces, instead switched sides and joined Go-Daigo. With Ashikaga's support, the rebellion succeeded. In 1333, Kamakura fell to rebel forces, and the Hojo regents were destroyed. The Kamakura shogunate, which had lasted nearly 150 years, came to an end. The fall of Kamakura, however, did not result in the restoration of imperial power that Go-Daigo envisioned. The emperor attempted to rule directly, implementing policies that alienated many of the warrior families who had supported him. Within just 3 years, Ashikaga Takauji turned against Go-Daigo, established a rival emperor, and in 1336 had himself named shogun. The Ashikaga shogunate had begun, inaugurating a new and turbulent era in Japanese history. The Ashikaga shogunate, also called the Muromachi shogunate after the district in Kyoto where it was headquartered, represented both the height of medieval Japanese culture and the beginning of the warrior class's descent into devastating civil war. This brilliant cultural achievement amid increasing military chaos characterized the entire period from 1336 to 1573. Ashikaga Takauji's establishment of a new shogunate proceeded from complicated circumstances. Emperor Go-Daigo refused to accept defeat and fled south, establishing a rival court at Yoshino. Japan thus had 2 emperors, 2 courts, and competing claims to legitimacy. This period of northern and southern courts lasted until 1392, when the courts were finally unified. The division complicated the political landscape and provided justification for conflicts that were often motivated more by territorial ambition than by loyalty to either imperial line. The Ashikaga shoguns ruled from Kyoto, unlike the Kamakura leaders who had maintained their distance from the imperial capital. This proximity to the traditional centers of culture had profound effects on warrior society. The samurai increasingly adopted refined cultural practices that had been the exclusive domain of the old aristocracy. The rough provincial warriors of earlier generations were being replaced by a class of warriors who appreciated poetry, practiced tea ceremony, and patronized artists while still maintaining their martial skills. The third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, who ruled from 1368 to 1394, exemplified this cultural sophistication. He built the magnificent Kinkaku-ji, the Golden Pavilion, in Kyoto, a structure that combined Buddhist architecture with warrior aesthetics and aristocratic refinement. Yoshimitsu patronized No theatre, which was transforming from rustic entertainment into a refined art form. He collected Chinese artworks and established official trade relations with Ming China, bringing wealth and cultural influence to his government. Yet beneath this cultural flowering, the Ashikaga shogunate's political authority remained fragile. The shogun's control over the provinces depended on the loyalty of powerful warrior families who served as military governors. These families, called shugo daimyo, had accumulated considerable autonomy and power within their domains. Unlike the earlier Kamakura system where the shogun appointed governors who could be replaced, the Ashikaga shugo positions became effectively hereditary within powerful families who viewed their provinces as personal possessions. Several families emerged as particularly powerful. The Hosokawa controlled multiple provinces and provided some of the shogunate's most important officials. The Yamana family at one point governed 11 provinces. The Hatakeyama, the Shiba, and other houses similarly commanded extensive territories and large military forces. These families competed for influence within the shogunal government while simultaneously building their regional power bases. The cultural achievements of the Muromachi period extended across multiple domains. Zen Buddhism reached its peak influence, with the great Zen monasteries in Kyoto serving as centers not just of religious practice, but of learning, art, and culture. Zen monks served as diplomats, advisors, and cultural mediators. The aesthetic principles associated with Zen simplicity, asymmetry, naturalness, and subtle profundity permeated Japanese arts. Landscape painting flourished under Zen influence, with artists like Sesshu creating ink paintings that captured the essence of natural scenes with minimal brushstrokes. These paintings weren't mere representations of landscapes, but expressions of spiritual insight achieved through meditation and close observation. The aesthetic of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence, developed during this era and would profoundly influence Japanese culture for centuries. The tea ceremony evolved from a simple social custom into an elaborate ritual practice that expressed profound aesthetic and philosophical principles. Senno Rikyu, though he lived slightly later, would codify tea ceremony practices that had developed during the Muromachi period. The ceremony took place in small rustic tea houses where participants, regardless of their normal social status, gathered as equals to appreciate simple utensils, carefully prepared tea, and moments of tranquility. For samurai, the tea ceremony offered respite from warfare and an opportunity to cultivate spiritual refinement. Architecture during the Muromachi period developed distinctive styles that balanced simplicity with subtle elegance. The Shoin style of residential architecture, which emerged during this era, featured tatami mat floors, sliding paper doors, and built-in shelves and writing desks. This style, originally developed for the living quarters of Zen abbots, was adopted by the warrior class and would become the standard for Japanese traditional architecture. Gardens reached new heights of sophistication. The famous rock garden at Ryoanji in Kyoto, though perhaps constructed slightly later, exemplifies the Muromachi aesthetic. These dry landscape gardens, called karasansui, used carefully arranged rocks, gravel, and minimal plantings to create abstract representations of natural landscapes or philosophical concepts. They were designed for contemplation rather than physical movement through space, reflecting the meditative practices of Zen Buddhism. Despite these cultural achievements, political instability increased throughout the 15th century. The shogun's authority over the shugo daimyo continued to weaken. In 1467, a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family, combined with conflicts over inheritance in several powerful shugo houses, erupted into open warfare. The Onin War, lasting from 1467 to 1477, devastated Kyoto and marked the beginning of Japan's descent into widespread civil war. The Onin War began as a dispute over who would succeed the 8th Ashikaga shogun. Two powerful shugo families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, supported different candidates and marshaled their forces in Kyoto itself. Other warrior families throughout Japan aligned with one side or the other, though often their choices reflected their own regional rivalries, rather than any deep commitment to the succession dispute that had triggered the conflict. The fighting in Kyoto was devastating. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands occupied sections of the capital, building fortifications and conducting military operations in what had been a city dedicated to culture and religion. Temples burned, palaces were destroyed, and much of the city's population fled to the countryside. The fighting eventually spread beyond Kyoto as regional powers seized the opportunity to attack their neighbours. What made the Onin War particularly significant was not its military outcomes. The war ended essentially in stalemate with no clear victor, but its demonstration that the shogun could no longer maintain order. Local powers had fought openly in the capital, destroying much of the city, and the shogun had been powerless to stop them. When the war finally ended in 1477, it was due to exhaustion rather than any restoration of shogunal authority. The period following the Onin War is known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, which lasted from roughly 1467 to 1568, though some historians extend it until the final unification in 1600. During this period, central authority collapsed almost completely. The shogun remained in Kyoto, but as a powerless figurehead. Real power resided with the daimyo, regional warlords who controlled provinces or groups of provinces, and fought each other in an endless struggle for territory and dominance. The Sengoku period witnessed the rise of a new type of daimyo, called Sengoku daimyo, who differed significantly from their predecessors. The older Shugo daimyo had derived their authority from shogunal appointment and claimed legitimacy through official position. The Sengoku daimyo seized power through military force and maintained it through effective governance and constant military readiness. They were self-made rulers who might come from any background minor aristocratic families, wealthy merchants, or even peasants with military talent. These new daimyo governed their domains with increasing efficiency and control. They conducted land surveys to maximize tax revenue, encouraged agricultural development to support larger populations and armies, established castle towns that served as administrative and commercial centers, and promulgated house laws that regulated everything from criminal justice to marriage customs. The successful daimyo combined military prowess with administrative skill, understanding that effective governance was essential to maintaining the military power necessary for survival. The warfare of the Sengoku period became increasingly sophisticated and deadly. Armies grew larger, with major daimyo able to field forces of tens of thousands of soldiers. The composition of these armies changed significantly. While samurai still formed the elite core, they were now vastly outnumbered by foot soldiers called ashigaru, who were drawn from the peasant population. These foot soldiers, equipped with spears and later with firearms, became crucial components of military power. The introduction of firearms to Japan in 1543, when Portuguese merchants arrived on the island of Tanegashima, revolutionized warfare. Japanese swordsmiths quickly mastered the technology of gun-making, and within decades Japan was producing firearms in quantities that exceeded production in most European countries. The arquebus, called Tanegashima Teppo in Japanese, proved devastatingly effective on the battlefield. Massed formations of ashigaru armed with these weapons could destroy charging cavalry, and quickly decided battles that might otherwise have required hours of combat. The samurai's traditional emphasis on individual combat and archery became less relevant in this new military environment. However, the samurai class adapted rather than becoming obsolete. They evolved into a combined arms force, with samurai serving as cavalry, commanders, elite infantry, and administrators. The samurai sword, which had been a secondary weapon, gained increased importance in close combat situations where firearms were impractical. The myth of the katana as the soul of the samurai actually emerged during this period, partly as a way for the warrior class to maintain their distinctive identity in an age when peasant foot soldiers had become militarily crucial. Castle architecture evolved rapidly during the Sengoku period in response to new military technologies. The earlier simple mountain fortifications gave way to sophisticated castle complexes that combined defensibility with administrative function. These new castles featured multiple layers of walls, complex gate systems that forced attackers to expose themselves to defensive fire from multiple angles, and massive stone foundations that could withstand cannon fire. The castle keep, or tenshu, served as both a final defensive position and a symbol of the daimyo's power. The most successful daimyo of the Sengoku period combined military talent, political acumen, and often ruthless pragmatism. They formed and broke alliances as circumstances required, adopted new military technologies eagerly, and governed their domains with increasing centralization. Family ties and ancient lineages mattered less than demonstrated ability. This meritocratic aspect of Sengoku warfare created opportunities for talented individuals to rise from obscurity to positions of great power. The constant warfare of the Sengoku period, while devastating to common people and destructive to established institutions, also generated a dynamic energy that drove innovation in military affairs, administration, and eventually culture. The successful daimyo proved to be effective state builders, creating miniature kingdoms within their domains that featured increasingly sophisticated governance. These experiments in regional administration would provide models for the eventual reunification of Japan. The Sengoku period represents perhaps the most dramatic and violent era in samurai history, a time when Japan fragmented into dozens of competing domains and warfare became endemic. Yet this age of strife also produced some of history's most remarkable military leaders and set the stage for Japan's eventual reunification under a powerful centralized government. The period from the late 15th century through the late 16th century witnessed constant warfare, incredible acts of courage and betrayal, and the transformation of the samurai from medieval warriors into early modern military professionals. By the late 1500s, Japan had effectively dissolved into dozens of independent domains, each ruled by a daimyo who governed through military force rather than legitimate appointment. Some estimates suggest there were as many as 250 daimyo at the height of the Sengoku period, though this number fluctuated constantly as domains were conquered, divided, or combined. The map of Japan resembled a patchwork quilt, with boundaries shifting after every battle. The lives of common people during this era were difficult and dangerous. Armies constantly marched through the countryside, requisitioning supplies and sometimes destroying crops to deny resources to enemies. Villages might be ruled by one daimyo one year and another the next, with each change bringing new tax demands and regulations. Yet there were also opportunities. The constant warfare created demand for soldiers, allowing peasants with military talent to rise through the ranks. The breakdown of rigid social hierarchies meant that ability mattered more than birth in determining one's fate. The concept of Gekkokujo, the low overthrowing the high, became a defining characteristic of the Sengoku period. Vassals betrayed and replaced their lords. Lower-ranking warriors seized power from incompetent leaders, and entire domains changed hands through internal coups as well as external conquest. This ruthless meritocracy created a dynamic but unstable political environment where no position was secure and constant vigilance was necessary for survival. Three figures emerged in the mid to late 16th century who would ultimately end the Sengoku period and reunify Japan. Their accomplishments were so significant that they are often referred to by a famous saying, "Oda made the cake, Hideyoshi baked it, and Tokugawa ate it." Each of these men contributed essential elements to the reunification process, and understanding their achievements is crucial to comprehending how the samurai transitioned from feudal warriors to bureaucratic administrators. Oda Nobunaga was born in 1534 into a minor daimyo family in Owari Province, in central Japan. As a young man, he earned a reputation for eccentric behavior and unconventional thinking, qualities that would serve him well in the chaotic Sengoku environment. When his father died in 1551, Nobunaga faced challenges from within his own family and from neighboring daimyo who saw an opportunity to conquer Owari. Through a combination of military skill, political maneuvering, and sheer ruthlessness, Nobunaga consolidated control of his home province and began expanding his power. Nobunaga's approach to warfare differed from traditional samurai tactics in several crucial ways. He enthusiastically adopted firearms and organized his Ashigari foot soldiers into disciplined units trained to fire in volleys, maximizing the effectiveness of their weapons. He understood logistics and administration, ensuring his armies were well supplied and properly compensated. Most importantly, he showed no sentimental attachment to traditional ways when they proved ineffective. If a tactic worked, he used it. If it didn't, he discarded it, regardless of how honorable or traditional it might be. In 1560, a pivotal moment in Nobunaga's rise occurred at the Battle of Okehazama. Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan, led an army of perhaps 25,000 men toward Kyoto, passing through Nobunaga's territory. Nobunaga commanded a force of perhaps only 2,000 to 3,000 warriors, a seemingly hopeless disadvantage. Rather than accept defeat, Nobunaga led his forces in a daring surprise attack during a thunderstorm, targeting Imagawa's headquarters. In the resulting confusion, Imagawa was killed, and his army retreated in disarray. This victory established Nobunaga's reputation and eliminated a major obstacle to his expansion. Throughout the 1560s, Nobunaga steadily expanded his domain, conquering neighboring provinces and forming strategic alliances. In 1568, he marched on Kyoto, ostensibly to support Ashikaga Yoshiki's claim to the shogunate. Nobunaga's forces entered the capital, installed Yoshiaki as shogun, and established Nobunaga as the real power behind the throne. This gave Nobunaga a veneer of legitimacy while he continued his conquests. Nobunaga faced opposition from multiple powerful enemies. Various daimyo formed coalitions against him, viewing his growing power with alarm. Buddhist religious institutions, which had accumulated considerable military force during the Sengoku period, also opposed him. The Iko-Iki, a militant Buddhist movement that controlled parts of central Japan, fought fiercely against Nobunaga's forces. Nobunaga's response to these religious military organizations was characteristically ruthless. The siege of Ishiyama Honganji, the fortress temple of the Iko-Iki near modern Osaka, lasted from 1570 to 1580. Nobunaga's forces besieged the complex, which was defended by thousands of warrior monks and their supporters. The siege featured some of the largest naval battles in Japanese history, as both sides used fleets to supply and reinforce their positions. Eventually, through a combination of military pressure and negotiated settlement, the temple was surrendered. Even more shocking was Nobunaga's destruction of Mount Hiei in 1571. This mountain complex northeast of Kyoto housed the headquarters of the Tendai Buddhist sect, and had been a center of religious and cultural life for centuries. When the monks of Mount Hiei opposed him, Nobunaga surrounded the mountain with his army and set fire to every building. Sources report that thousands of monks, perhaps as many as 20,000, were killed. The destruction of Mount Hiei shocked all Japan and demonstrated that Nobunaga would let nothing, not even revered religious institutions, stand in his way. Nobunaga's castle at Azuchi, built beginning in 1576, symbolized his power and ambitions. The castle featured a 7-story main keep decorated with gold leaf, colorful paintings, and the finest craftsmanship available. It combined military defensibility with unprecedented grandeur, serving as both fortress and palace. The castle town that grew around Azuchi was organized as a free market where merchants could trade without paying the various tolls and fees that normally hindered commerce. Nobunaga understood that economic prosperity generated the wealth necessary to maintain military power. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled roughly 1/3 of Japan, including the capital region and much of central Honshu. His armies were the most modern and effective in the country. His administrative reforms were creating more efficient governance in his territories. Total unification seemed within reach. Then, in June 1582, disaster struck. One of Nobunaga's generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, suddenly betrayed him, attacking Nobunaga while he rested at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with minimal guards. Trapped and overwhelmed, Nobunaga committed seppuku as the temple burned around him. His body was never recovered. He was 49 years old. The reasons for Akechi's betrayal remain unclear. Perhaps he bore some grudge against Nobunaga, who was known to treat subordinates harshly. Perhaps he saw an opportunity to seize power for himself. Regardless of his motives, his triumph was short-lived. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, another of Nobunaga's generals, rushed back from a campaign in western Japan, defeated Akechi in battle 13 days later, and positioned himself as Nobunaga's successor. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rise represented the ultimate expression of Gekkokujo, the low overthrowing the high. Born in 1537 to a peasant family, Hideyoshi had entered Nobunaga's service as a lowly foot soldier. Through intelligence, political skill, and military talent, he rose through the ranks to become one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. After Nobunaga's death, Hideyoshi maneuvered politically to sideline Nobunaga's surviving family members and other rival generals, establishing himself as the dominant power in Japan. Hideyoshi completed Nobunaga's work of unification, but he did so more through diplomacy and intimidation than through pure military conquest. He understood that many daimyo would submit to a stronger power rather than face destruction. Between 1583 and 1590, Hideyoshi brought the remaining independent daimyo under his control through a combination of military campaigns, strategic marriages, exchanges of territory, and the implied threat of his overwhelming military power. In 1585, Hideyoshi was appointed Kampaku, or imperial regent, an ancient aristocratic position that had fallen into disuse. This appointment gave him official authority to rule Japan in the emperor's name. Later he took the title of Taiko, which essentially meant retired regent, but allowed him to continue wielding power while nominally passing the office to an adopted son. Hideyoshi could not become shogun, a position traditionally reserved for those of Minamoto lineage, but his control of the country was absolute regardless of titles. Hideyoshi implemented several revolutionary social reforms that would have lasting effects on Japanese society and on the samurai class. In 1588, he issued the Sword Hunt Edict, ordering the confiscation of all weapons from farmers and religious institutions. Only samurai could legally possess swords and other weapons. This decree accomplished multiple purposes. It reduced the possibility of peasant uprisings, established a clear legal distinction between the warrior class and commoners, and provided metal that Hideyoshi claimed would be used to construct a giant statue of Buddha. The following year, Hideyoshi issued regulations that prohibited people from changing their social status. Samurai could not become farmers or merchants, farmers could not become merchants, and so forth. These class separation edicts, while not perfectly enforced, began the process of freezing Japanese society into rigid status categories. The fluid social mobility that had characterized the Sengoku period was being replaced by a fixed class system. Hideyoshi conducted comprehensive land surveys throughout his domains, measuring fields, assessing productivity, and standardizing tax rates. These surveys, far more thorough than any previous efforts, allowed for more efficient tax collection and gave Hideyoshi detailed knowledge of his territory's economic capacity. The surveys also clarified land ownership, reducing disputes and establishing clear relationships between cultivators and landowners. With Japan unified and at peace for the first time in over a century, Hideyoshi turned his attention outward. His ambitions extended beyond Japan to the conquest of China and possibly beyond. In 1592, he launched the first of two invasions of Korea, intending to use the peninsula as a stepping stone to Ming China. A force of roughly 158,000 troops crossed to Korea, initially achieving rapid success. The Japanese armies, hardened by decades of constant warfare in Japan and equipped with large numbers of firearms, overwhelmed Korean defenders and captured Seoul within 3 weeks. However, the Japanese advance stalled due to several factors. Korean naval forces under Admiral Yi Sun-sin, using the famous turtle ships, ironclad vessels designed for ramming and close combat, destroyed Japanese supply lines and prevented reinforcement. Korean guerrilla fighters harassed Japanese occupation forces. Most decisively, Ming China sent massive armies to aid Korea, and the Japanese found themselves fighting a much larger and well-equipped enemy far from their supply bases. The first invasion ground down into stalemate, and after lengthy negotiations, Japanese forces withdrew in 1593. In 1597, frustrated by the collapse of peace talks, Hideyoshi launched a second invasion. This campaign was even less successful than the first. The Japanese forces made limited territorial gains, faced constant opposition, and achieved nothing strategically significant. Then, in August 1598, Hideyoshi died at age 62. The Japanese forces in Korea immediately began withdrawing, and by the end of the year, all had returned to Japan. The Korean campaigns proved disastrous for all involved. Korea was devastated, its population reduced by war, famine, and disease. Ming China exhausted its treasury helping to defend Korea, contributing to the dynasty's eventual fall decades later. For Japan, The campaigns accomplished nothing while costing enormous sums and the lives of tens of thousands of warriors. Some daimyo who had participated heavily in the Korean campaigns found their domains financially ruined. Hideyoshi's death created a succession crisis. He left behind a young son, Hideyori, and had created a council of 5 powerful daimyo to serve as regents until the boy came of age. However, one member of this council, Tokugawa Ieyasu, possessed far greater power than the others. Ieyasu, born in 1543, was from an old warrior family and had been an ally of Nobunaga and then of Hideyoshi. He controlled extensive domains in eastern Japan and commanded the loyalty of many daimyo. Tensions between Ieyasu and other powerful daimyo who resented his dominance came to a head in 1600. The country divided into 2 coalitions, the Eastern Army supporting Ieyasu and the Western Army supporting Ishida Mitsunari and ostensibly defending Hideyori's rights. On October 21, 1600, the 2 armies, totaling perhaps 160,000 warriors combined, met at Sekigahara in central Japan for the decisive battle. The Battle of Sekigahara lasted only about 6 hours but determined Japan's future for the next 2.5 centuries. Initially the forces seemed evenly matched, but Ieyasu had secretly negotiated with several daimyo in the Western Army to betray their side during the battle. When these forces switched sides or simply withdrew from the fighting, the Western Army collapsed. Some estimates suggest 30,000 warriors died in the battle and its immediate aftermath. Ieyasu's victory was total and unopposed. In 1603, the emperor appointed Tokugawa Ieyasu as shogun, formally establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Ieyasu had achieved what Nobunaga and Hideyoshi had sought, the position of shogun and complete control of Japan. The Sengoku period was over. Peace, enforced by overwhelming military power concentrated in Tokugawa hands, would prevail. For the samurai class, this peace would bring unprecedented transformation. The ethical code known as bushido, meaning the way of the warrior, represents one of the most misunderstood aspects of samurai history. Popular imagination often treats bushido as an ancient, unchanging code that governed samurai behavior from the earliest days of the warrior class. The reality is far more complex. Bushido, as a formalized system of ethics, primarily developed during the peaceful Edo period when samurai needed to justify their existence in a society without war. However, the values and practices that would later be codified into bushido had deep roots in earlier samurai culture, evolving across centuries. The early samurai of the Heian and Kamakura periods operated according to practical considerations of honor and reputation, rather than abstract ethical systems. A warrior's honor rested primarily on his achievements in battle, his skill with weapons, his loyalty to his lord as long as that lord rewarded him appropriately, and his lineage. Acts that enhanced reputation were considered honorable. Acts that diminished reputation were shameful. This pragmatic understanding of honor allowed for considerable flexibility in behavior. Loyalty, which would later become the central virtue of bushido, was important but conditional during the early periods. A warrior served his lord in exchange for land, position, or payment. If the lord failed to provide adequate rewards, if he proved incompetent, or if better opportunities arose elsewhere, a warrior might legitimately change his allegiance. Betrayal for purely self-serving reasons was condemned, but pragmatic shifting of loyalties was accepted as part of warrior life. The concept of face, or reputation, dominated warrior behavior. Public humiliation represented one of the gravest injuries a warrior could suffer. Ritual practices developed to protect and restore face. The practice of announcing one's name, lineage, and accomplishments before battle served to establish reputation and ensure that one's deeds would be properly recognized. The custom of taking enemy heads and presenting them for inspection ensured that achievements in battle could be verified and credited. Courage in battle represented the most fundamental warrior virtue across all periods. A samurai was expected to face death without flinching, to charge into danger when ordered, and to endure pain and hardship without complaint. This emphasis on courage wasn't merely about personal glory but served practical military purposes. Armies whose warriors would stand firm rather than flee were more effective in combat. The samurai's willingness to face death, even to seek death if necessary, gave them psychological advantage over less committed opponents. The practice of seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, exemplified the samurai's relationship with death and honor. Seppuku developed during the medieval period as a means for defeated warriors to avoid capture and for those who had failed their duties to restore honor. The practice involved specific procedures. The warrior would compose a death poem reflecting on his life and accepting his fate with equanimity. He would then kneel formally, open his garment to expose his abdomen, and use a short sword to cut his belly, usually from left to right and then upward. A trusted assistant, called a kaishakunin, would then decapitate the warrior with a sword stroke, ending his suffering quickly while leaving enough skin at the front to prevent the head from rolling away. Seppuku was not merely a method of suicide, but a ritual that demonstrated courage, self-control, and commitment to honor even at the moment of greatest pain. A warrior who performed seppuku properly earned respect and could restore honor that had been lost through failure or offense. The act required mental and physical preparation, as the pain of disembowelment was extreme, and the warrior needed to maintain composure until the final sword stroke ended his life. During the Muromachi and Sengoku periods, as warriors increasingly engaged with Zen Buddhism and other philosophical traditions, more sophisticated ethical concepts began to permeate warrior culture. Zen's emphasis on mental discipline, its teaching about maintaining clarity of mind in any situation, and its acceptance of death as a natural part of existence, all resonated with warrior experiences. Zen monks served as advisors to many daimyo and became important transmitters of cultural and ethical ideas. Confucian concepts, particularly concerning proper relationships between superior and inferior, lord and retainer, also influenced warrior ethics. Confucianism emphasized loyalty, filial piety, proper conduct according to one's station, and the importance of education and self-cultivation. These ideas aligned well with the needs of daimyo seeking to maintain control over their warrior retainers and encouraged the development of more rigid codes of behavior. The sword occupied a special place in warrior culture and ethics. By the Muromachi period, the sword had transcended its purely practical function as a weapon to become a symbol of the warrior's identity and spiritual state. The process of creating a katana involved elaborate rituals and demanded exceptional craftsmanship. The swordsmith would purify himself before beginning work, make offerings to the gods, and approach the forging process as a spiritual practice as much as a technical craft. The curved blade of the Japanese sword, perfected during the Kamakura period, was designed for cutting rather than thrusting. The single-edge blade was differentially hardened, meaning the edge was much harder than the back, creating a blade that could hold an extremely sharp edge while remaining flexible enough to absorb impacts without breaking. The visible grain pattern on a fine blade, called heimen, resulted from this differential hardening and was considered a mark of the sword's quality and beauty. A samurai's relationship with his sword was deeply personal. The sword might be passed down through generations, acquiring a history and reputation of its own. Warriors gave their swords names, treated them as sacred objects, and believed that a sword contained the warrior's spirit. The practice of sword maintenance became a meditation exercise, with the warrior carefully cleaning and oiling his blade while contemplating the weapon's deadly purpose and his own mortality. Swordsmanship evolved into a sophisticated martial art with multiple schools and styles. These schools, called ryu, developed distinctive techniques, training methods, and philosophical approaches. Some emphasized aggressive, powerful attacks, others focused on defense and counterattack. Still others taught primarily defensive techniques designed to disarm opponents without killing them. Masters of these schools were respected figures who might serve as instructors to daimyo and their retainers. The study of swordsmanship wasn't merely about learning to kill efficiently, but about mental and spiritual development. Students spent years practicing basic cuts and forms, training their bodies to execute techniques with perfect precision while cultivating the mental clarity necessary for combat. Advanced practitioners sought a state of mind called mushin, or no mind, where action occurred without conscious thought, allowing instantaneous response to any situation. Archery, though it had declined in military importance with the rise of firearms, retained significant cultural importance. The practice of kyujutsu, the martial art of archery, emphasized proper form, mental discipline, and spiritual development as much as accuracy. Ceremonial archery competitions continued even during the Edo period, with warriors demonstrating their skill in traditional samurai arts even when such skills had limited practical application. The warrior's relationship with his horse was another important aspect of samurai culture. Horsemanship had been central to samurai warfare since the earliest days, and the bond between warrior and mount was considered sacred. Warriors trained their horses for battle, teaching them to remain calm amid the chaos of combat. The care and feeding of horses represented a significant expense, and the quality of a warrior's mounts indicated his wealth and status. Daily life for a medieval samurai involved constant preparation for war. Physical training consumed much of his time, not only weapons practice, but also swimming, climbing, running, and other skills that might prove useful in battle. Warriors practiced while wearing their armor to maintain conditioning for its weight and restriction. Mental training through meditation and study of classical texts complemented physical preparation. A samurai's equipment represented substantial investment. A full set of armor could cost more than a peasant might earn in years. The armor consisted of small plates of iron or leather laced together with silk cords, creating flexible protection. The distinctive helmet, or kabuto, featured a face mask that protected the face while presenting a fierce appearance intended to intimidate enemies. Elaborate crests and decorations on armor served both to identify the wearer in battle and to display his artistic taste and wealth. The samurai's home life varied greatly depending on his status. Lower-ranking samurai might live simply in modest dwellings, their warrior equipment comprising the bulk of their possessions. Higher-ranking samurai and daimyo maintained multiple residences, employed numerous servants and retainers, and lived in considerable comfort. Yet even wealthy samurai were expected to maintain warrior virtues, to practice frugality rather than pure luxury, and to be prepared to abandon comfort for campaign at any moment. Family relationships for samurai followed strict hierarchical patterns influenced by Confucian philosophy. The father possessed absolute authority over his household. Sons, especially the eldest who would inherit the family's position and property, received intensive training in warrior arts and ethics. Daughters were educated in managing households and in the cultural accomplishments appropriate to their station. Marriages were arranged to strengthen family alliances and political connections rather than for romantic attachment. Women in samurai families occupied complex positions. They were subordinate to male authority, certainly, but they managed households, controlled family finances, and in the absence of their husbands during campaigns, might need to defend the household. Some samurai women learned combat skills, particularly with the naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade that was particularly suited to female warriors' different physical proportions and strength compared to men. Stories of female warriors, though relatively uncommon, dot Japanese history. The education of a samurai extended beyond martial training. Literacy was essential, as warriors needed to read military texts, maintain records, and conduct correspondence. Calligraphy was practiced both for its practical applications and as an art form that developed discipline and aesthetic sense. Poetry composition, particularly in the 31-syllable waka form, was considered an essential accomplishment for cultured warriors. The ability to compose an appropriate poem on various occasions demonstrated refinement and education. The cultural expectations for samurai behavior emphasized restraint and control. Emotional displays were generally viewed as undignified, though intense emotions were certainly felt and could be expressed in appropriate contexts such as poetry or during private moments. In public, a warrior maintained composure regardless of circumstances. This emphasis on emotional control served both psychological purposes, helping warriors manage the stress of combat, and social purposes, maintaining proper hierarchical relationships. The relationship between lord and retainer formed the foundation of warrior society. This relationship was ideally one of mutual obligation. The lord provided land, income, protection, and opportunity for advancement. The retainer provided military service, loyalty, and administrative skills. The ceremonies surrounding this relationship became increasingly elaborate over time, with formal vows, exchange of gifts, and symbolic gestures reinforcing the personal bond between individuals. Yet the reality often failed to match the ideal. Lords might demand service without adequate compensation. Retainers might prove disloyal or incompetent. The masterless samurai, called ronin, represented those who had lost their positions due to their lord's death, the lord's loss of domain, or their own failure or choice to leave service. Ronin occupied an ambiguous and often desperate position in warrior society, possessing martial skills and warrior status, but lacking the economic support and social position that came from service to a lord. The formalization of bushido came primarily during the Edo period, when peace eliminated the practical function of warriors. Confucian scholars serving the Tokugawa shogunate worked to create ethical systems that would justify continued samurai privileges while encouraging behavior that supported social stability rather than martial prowess. The most influential work in this process was Hagakure, written in the early 18th century by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, a former samurai who had become a Buddhist monk. Hagakure presented bushido as absolute, unquestioning loyalty to one's lord, even to the point of dying meaninglessly for one's lord, even if that lord was unworthy. The famous opening line, "The way of the warrior is found in death," encapsulated this philosophy. Tsunetomo argued that a samurai should make decisions as if already dead, free from the fear that might lead to hesitation or calculation of personal advantage. This extreme formulation of loyalty differed significantly from the more pragmatic warrior ethics of earlier periods. Another influential text, Budosho Shinshu by Daidoji Yuzan, written around 1700, emphasized the samurai's duty to maintain martial spirit and readiness even in peaceful times. Yuzan urged samurai to train constantly, to study military history and strategy, and to cultivate the mental attitudes necessary for warfare even if actual combat seemed unlikely. These texts and others like them created an idealized vision of the samurai as selfless warriors dedicated entirely to their lords and to the preservation of martial values. The reality, of course, was more complicated. Many samurai during the Edo period focused more on their administrative duties or cultural pursuits than on martial training. The rigid ethical demands of formalized bushido represented an ideal that few could completely attain in practice. Yet these ideals shaped samurai self-identity and influenced behavior even when they weren't perfectly followed. The tension between the peaceful reality of Edo Japan and the martial ideology of bushido would ultimately contribute to the explosive events of the 19th century. The Tokugawa victory at Sekigahara in 1600 inaugurated the longest period of sustained peace in Japanese history. The Edo period, lasting from 1603 to 1868, saw the transformation of the samurai from warriors whose primary function was combat into bureaucratic administrators who maintained their martial identity even while rarely, if ever, drawing their swords in anger. This paradox warriors without war created both remarkable cultural achievements and profound social tensions that would ultimately contribute to the system's collapse. Tokugawa Ieyasu's immediate priority after Sekigahara was ensuring that no rival could challenge his supremacy. He redistributed conquered domains to rewarded allies and placed potential enemies under close supervision. Daimyo were classified into three categories. The Shinpan were Tokugawa family members who governed important domains and provided a reliable base of support. The Feudal were families that had been Tokugawa allies before Sekigahara. They received domains in strategically important locations and were eligible for important positions in the shogunal government. The Tozuma were families that had submitted to Tokugawa only after Sekigahara or had fought against the Tokugawa at the battle. These daimyo, despite often controlling large and wealthy domains, were excluded from shogunal administration and watched carefully for any signs of disloyalty. The shogunate headquarters in Edo, modern Tokyo, grew rapidly into Japan's largest city and the effective capital, though the emperor remained in Kyoto as the source of ceremonial legitimacy. The shogunate controlled directly roughly 1/4 of Japan's agricultural land, including most major cities, important ports, and key mining districts. This economic base, combined with the political structure that gave the shogun authority over all daimyo, created unprecedented centralized control. The most important mechanism for maintaining this control was the sankin-kotai system, or alternate attendance system, formalized in 1635. This system required all daimyo to maintain residences in Edo, and to spend alternate years residing there, attending upon the shogun. When a daimyo returned to his domain, his wife and heir remained in Edo as hostages, ensuring the daimyo's continued loyalty. The practical effect of this system was to drain daimyo finances through the expense of maintaining multiple households and travelling with appropriate retinues, reducing their ability to fund military adventures. The sankin-kotai system had profound cultural and economic effects beyond its political purpose. The constant movement of daimyo processions, sometimes consisting of hundreds of people, stimulated the economy of towns along the major highways. The concentration of daimyo and their retinues in Edo created demand for goods and services that made the city a bustling commercial centre. The prolonged residence of samurai from all regions in Edo facilitated the development of a more unified national culture, as regional variations were gradually smoothed by constant interaction. The Tokugawa shogunate implemented increasingly strict social regulations designed to maintain stability and prevent the kind of upheaval that had characterized the Sengoku period. The class system was rigidly defined, with samurai at the top followed by farmers, then artisans, then merchants, with various outcast groups below even this hierarchy. In theory, these classes were strictly separated, with sumptuary laws regulating what each class could wear, what size houses they could build, and even what foods they could eat. The samurai class itself was hierarchically organized with precise gradations of rank. At the top were the daimyo, defined as warriors controlling domains producing at least 10,000 koku of rice per year, one koku being roughly equivalent to the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. Below the daimyo were their retainers, ranging from high-ranking administrators who themselves commanded substantial incomes to lower-ranking samurai, who might struggle financially despite their privileged status. The economic position of the samurai class became increasingly problematic as the Edo period progressed. Samurai received stipends, usually calculated in rice, from their daimyo. These stipends were hereditary and fixed, but over time, inflation eroded their purchasing power, while the samurai's cultural obligations required expenditures that grew steadily more expensive. Many samurai fell into debt, borrowing from merchants who, despite their theoretically lower social status, increasingly became the real holders of economic power. The samurai's removal from direct involvement with land management had significant consequences. Unlike medieval European knights who often managed their own estates, Edo period samurai received stipends but had no direct control over agricultural production. They were urban dwellers, residing in castle towns where they performed administrative duties rather than rural landlords supervising farming. This separation from the land made them dependent on the daimyo's financial management and vulnerable to economic changes they couldn't control. Daily life for an Edo period samurai varied enormously depending on rank and financial circumstances. Lower-ranking samurai lived modestly in small houses within the castle town, often struggling to maintain the appearances expected of their status. They might serve in various capacities as guards, clerks, teachers in domain schools, or administrators of various projects. Higher-ranking samurai lived in substantial compounds, commanded their own retinues of lower-ranking samurai, and participated in the daimyo's decision-making processes. The emphasis on education increased dramatically during the Edo period. Samurai were expected to be literate and educated in Chinese classics, Japanese literature, history, and various practical subjects relevant to administration. Domain schools were established to educate samurai youth, teaching not only academic subjects but also martial arts, though the latter received decreasing emphasis as peace stretched across generations. Some domains established sophisticated educational systems that produced administrators capable of complex economic and social reforms. Military training continued despite the absence of warfare, though its character changed. Swordsmanship became increasingly formalized into distinct schools, each with the elaborate kata, predetermined forms, that students practiced endlessly. These kata, while based on combat techniques, became somewhat divorced from actual fighting, as generations of practitioners had no opportunity to test their techniques in real battles. The study of swordsmanship became as much about character development and maintaining connection to warrior traditions as about practical fighting skills. Other martial arts also flourished during the Edo period. Archery, spearmanship, horsemanship, and various grappling techniques were all systematically studied and transmitted through formal schools. New martial arts emerged, including various schools of jujutsu, unarmed combat techniques, that emphasized leverage and technique over strength. These arts provided ways for samurai to maintain their identity as warriors, even while performing primarily administrative functions. The strict regulations governing samurai behavior extended to minute details of daily life. Samurai were required to wear two swords, the long katana and shorter wakizashi, at all times when in public. These swords identified their wearer's status and symbolized the warrior's readiness to defend his honor. The privilege of wearing swords was exclusive to the samurai class, immediately marking them as separate from commoners. In practice, the swords were rarely drawn in anger, but their symbolic importance remained central to samurai identity. Samurai possessed the legal right of kiriste gomen, which allowed them to execute commoners who showed disrespect. This privilege, while occasionally exercised, was not the license for random violence that popular imagination sometimes suggests. Killing a commoner without adequate justification could result in punishment, and most samurai lived peacefully alongside the common people in their communities. Nevertheless, the existence of this privilege reinforced the vast social distance between samurai and other classes. The rigid social structure created particular hardship for ronin, masterless samurai. Some ronin were temporarily between positions, seeking new lords after their former employers had died or lost their domains. Others had been dismissed for incompetence or misbehavior. Still others had chosen to leave service for various reasons. Ronin retained their samurai status and privileges, but lacked the economic support that came from serving a lord. Some found employment as instructors in martial arts schools or as tutors. Others struggled in poverty, their warrior status preventing them from taking up commoner occupations even when desperate for income. The cultural flowering of the Edo period affected the samurai class profoundly. The rigid peace enforced by the Tokugawa system allowed for unprecedented artistic and intellectual development. Samurai, particularly those of higher rank with leisure time and resources, became important patrons and practitioners of various arts. Tea ceremony, ikebana, flower arrangement, poetry, painting, calligraphy, and other refined pursuits were considered appropriate for warriors who sought to cultivate themselves according to Confucian ideals. Neo-Confucianism, particularly the teachings of the Chinese philosopher Zhu Xi as interpreted by Japanese scholars, became the official ideology of the Tokugawa system. This philosophy emphasized social hierarchy, loyalty to superiors, filial piety, and self-cultivation through study and moral discipline. It provided intellectual justification for the existing social order, while encouraging samurai to see themselves as moral exemplars whose privileged position came with corresponding ethical responsibilities. Several important schools of thought emerged during the Edo period that challenged or modified orthodox Neo-Confucianism. The Kogaku, or ancient learning school, promoted by scholars like Ito Jinsai and Ogyu Sorai, argued for returning to original Confucian texts rather than later commentaries. Sorai in particular argued that warriors should study practical matters relevant to governance, rather than pursuing abstract philosophical speculation. His emphasis on practical learning influenced many domain administrations. The national learning movement, or Kokugaku, represented another significant intellectual current. Scholars like Motori Norinaga studied ancient Japanese texts, particularly the literary classics of the Heian period, seeking to recover supposedly pure Japanese thought uncorrupted by Chinese influence. This movement emphasized Japan's unique character and divine origins, ideas that would later contribute to the emperor-centered nationalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Literacy rates in Tokugawa Japan were remarkably high compared to other contemporary societies. Most samurai were literate, and literacy extended deeply into the commoner classes as well. This widespread literacy supported a flourishing publishing industry that produced everything from serious scholarly works to popular novels, poetry collections, and practical guides. Samurai participated in this literary culture as both producers and consumers, though official ideology often condemned popular literature as frivolous or corrupting. The urban culture of Edo and other major cities offered entertainment and diversions that samurai officially scorned but often secretly enjoyed. The pleasure quarters, legally sanctioned districts where prostitution was permitted and various entertainments were available, attracted samurai despite official disapproval. Kabuki theatre, with its dramatic presentations of historical events and contemporary scandals, drew audiences from all social classes, even though samurai was supposedly above such common entertainments. Economic development during the Edo period created tensions within the rigid social structure. Merchants, despite their theoretically low social status, accumulated wealth that exceeded that of many samurai. The money economy gradually supplanted rice-based exchange, but samurai stipends continued to be calculated in rice, creating complications as they needed to convert their rice allotments into cash to purchase goods. Some merchants lent money to daimyo and samurai, effectively controlling them through debt despite the social hierarchy that placed warriors above merchants. Several domains attempted reforms to address the financial problems afflicting the samurai class and domain governments. The most famous were the Kansi reforms implemented by the Matsudaira Sadanobu in the shogunal administration during the 1790s, and various domain-level reforms undertaken by capable administrators. These reforms typically involved austerity measures, debt forgiveness or restructuring, promotion of domestic industries to increase domain income, and attempts to return to simpler, more frugal lifestyles considered appropriate for warriors. The intellectual and social tensions building within the Edo system became increasingly apparent by the early 19th century. The rigid social structure seemed outdated to many observers. The samurai's role as parasitic administrators rather than productive workers troubled some thinkers who questioned why warriors should receive privileges when they no longer fought. The economic problems afflicting many domains seemed intractable within the existing system. Meanwhile, increasing awareness of Western power, transmitted through the limited Dutch trading presence at Nagasaki, created concerns about Japan's ability to defend itself. Despite these building tensions, the Tokugawa system appeared stable and permanent to most observers. The rigid social structure, the effective control exercised by the shogunate, and the generations of peace all suggested that the system would continue indefinitely. The samurai class had successfully transformed itself from warriors into bureaucrats, while maintaining its privileged position. The sword, though rarely drawn, still symbolized their status and power. Then, in 1853, American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay, demanding that Japan open itself to trade and diplomatic relations with the United States. This external shock would expose the weaknesses in the Tokugawa system and trigger the crisis that would ultimately destroy both the shogunate and the samurai class itself. The arrival of Perry's black ships in 1853 shattered the illusion of Tokugawa permanence and inaugurated 15 years of crisis that would culminate in the destruction of the shogunate, the restoration of imperial rule, and the abolition of the samurai class. The ending of the samurai era was not a gradual fade but a dramatic and often violent transformation, as Japan rushed to modernize in response to Western pressure, discarding institutions and social structures that had endured for centuries. Perry's squadron of 4 warships, steam-powered and heavily armed with modern cannon, represented technology far beyond anything Japan possessed. The shogunate, after 2.5 centuries of virtual isolation from the Western world, found itself unable to refuse American demands for trade agreements and coaling stations. In 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa opened Japan to limited trade and diplomatic relations. Similar treaties with other Western powers followed, establishing a pattern of unequal treaties that granted extraterritorial rights to foreigners and limited Japan's control over its own tariffs. These treaties exposed the shogunate's weakness. The government that claimed to expel the barbarians and protect Japan had instead capitulated to foreign demands without consulting the imperial court or the daimyo. This failure of the shogunate's fundamental responsibility protecting the realm from outside threats undermined its legitimacy and emboldened critics who had previously limited their opposition to economic and social policies. Opposition to the shogunate coalesced around several powerful Tozama domains in southwestern Japan, particularly Satsuma and Choshu. These domains, which had been excluded from shogunal administration since 1600, now positioned themselves as defenders of imperial authority and opponents of the illegitimate shogunal government. Their slogan, "Revere the Emperor, Expel the Barbarians," appealed to nationalist sentiment while providing cover for what was essentially a power struggle between the Tokugawa and rival warrior families. The samurai of these opposing domains were not a unified group. Some, particularly younger, lower-ranking samurai, genuinely believed in restoring imperial rule and expelling foreigners. Others saw the crisis as an opportunity for their domains to increase their power. Still others recognized that Japan needed to adopt Western technology and institutions to defend itself, even while they used anti-foreign rhetoric for political purposes. This diversity of motivations and goals would shape the complicated politics of the 1850s and 60s. Violence escalated throughout the 1860s. Xenophobic samurai, particularly from Choshu domain, attacked foreigners and Japanese who associated with them. The shogunate attempted to suppress these activities, leading to military conflicts with Choshu. Meanwhile, Satsuma domain played a more subtle game, building its military strength with Western weapons while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with the shogunate. Increasingly, samurai were drawing their swords not in defense of their lords, but in pursuit of political goals, a violation of traditional warrior ethics that reflected the breakdown of the old order. The shogunate, under the leadership of Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who became shogun in 1867, attempted reforms designed to strengthen its position. Military modernization received particular attention, with the government purchasing Western weapons, establishing Western-style military training programs, and sending missions to Europe to study modern institutions. These reforms, however, could not overcome the fundamental political problems facing the shogunate. Its association with the unpopular treaties, its apparent weakness in the face of foreign pressure, and the determined opposition of powerful domains. In November 1867, facing military pressure and political isolation, Tokugawa Yoshinobu resigned as shogun and returned political authority to the emperor, hoping this voluntary surrender would allow him to maintain influence in whatever new government emerged. This proved to be a miscalculation. On January 3, 1868, samurai forces from Satsuma, Choshu, and allied domains staged a coup in Kyoto, proclaiming the restoration of imperial rule and declaring that Yoshinobu's resignation was not sufficient. He must also surrender all his lands and positions. The Boshin War, lasting from January 1868 to June 1869, determined whether the Tokugawa could maintain any power under the new imperial government or would be completely destroyed. The war was fought primarily by samurai armies, but these armies increasingly resembled modern military forces rather than traditional warrior bands. Both sides used Western weapons extensively, including rifles, cannon, and even a few modern warships. The technology of warfare had changed, even if many participants still saw themselves as traditional warriors. The imperial forces, though initially smaller, benefited from superior modern weapons and eventually from international recognition. The Tokugawa forces, despite some early successes, gradually lost ground. The decisive battle at Toba-Fushimi near Kyoto in January 1868 saw the imperial forces, despite being outnumbered, defeat the Tokugawa army through superior tactics and firepower. Edo surrendered without a fight in May 1868, after negotiations between imperial representatives and Tokugawa officials who wished to avoid destroying the city. The final resistance came in the northern domain of Aizu, which had been closely allied with the Tokugawa, and eventually in Hokkaido, where a group of Tokugawa loyalists established a short-lived republic. The siege of Aizu was brutal, with the castle town being bombarded and burned. The defenders, including a unit of young samurai boys called the Byakutai, who committed mass suicide when they mistakenly believed the castle had fallen, fought with desperate courage but could not overcome the imperial forces' advantages in numbers and equipment. The Meiji Restoration, as this political revolution came to be called, placed the young Emperor Meiji, barely 15 years old, at the symbolic center of a new government dominated by samurai from the domains that had overthrown the shogunate. These leaders, including figures like Okubo Toshimichi, Saigo Takamori, and Kido Takayoshi, recognized that Japan needed rapid and comprehensive modernization to avoid the fate of China, which had been repeatedly defeated and humiliated by Western powers. The new government moved quickly to dismantle the feudal structure of Tokugawa Japan. In 1869, the daimyo were requested to return their domains to the emperor, transforming them from independent rulers into appointed governors of their former territories. In 1871, the domains were abolished entirely and replaced by a prefecture system of centralized administration. The daimyo received generous pensions as compensation for their lost positions, but their political power was gone. These reforms struck at the foundation of the samurai class. The abolition of domains meant that the lords whom samurai served no longer existed. The samurai's stipends, traditionally paid by their daimyo, were assumed by the new central government, but this was clearly a temporary arrangement. The samurai class, roughly 6% of the population, consumed a substantial portion of government revenue through their stipends, money the government desperately needed for modernization programs. In 1873, the government implemented military conscription, requiring commoners to serve in a new Western-style national army. This reform struck at the samurai's military monopoly, the fundamental basis of their social privilege. Now, peasant conscripts trained in modern infantry tactics and armed with rifles would defend Japan, not samurai warriors with their swords. The romantic notion of the individual warrior's skill determining battles was obsolete in an age of mass armies and industrial weapons. The following year, the government prohibited the wearing of swords in public, with exceptions only for formal occasions and for military and police personnel. This seemingly minor regulation had profound symbolic significance. The sword had been the visible marker of samurai status for centuries. Prohibiting its public wear effectively erased the most obvious distinction between samurai and commoners. Many samurai felt this regulation as a personal attack on their identity and honor. In 1876 came the final blow. The government commuted all samurai stipends into one-time payments of government bonds. Depending on the size of the original stipend, a samurai might receive bonds worth anywhere from 5 to 14 years of stipend income. After receiving these bonds, the government had no further financial obligations to former samurai. The samurai class had been abolished economically. Legally, former samurai still retained their status as shizoku, a term that replaced samurai, but this status now carried no special privileges or guaranteed income. These reforms left hundreds of thousands of former samurai in a difficult position. Their traditional role as warriors was obsolete. Their stipends, which many families had depended on for generations, had been converted to bonds that provided temporary income but would eventually be exhausted. They were encouraged to enter business or take up farming, occupations that samurai traditions had taught them to despise. Some former samurai successfully adapted, becoming entrepreneurs, teachers, or government officials. Many others struggled with poverty and loss of identity. Resentment among former samurai led to several armed rebellions against the new government. The largest and most serious was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the most prominent leaders of the Meiji Restoration. Saigo, troubled by the rapid pace of change and the government's disregard for traditional values, left the government and returned to Satsuma Domain, where he established schools teaching traditional martial arts and values. When government officials attempted to disarm these martial associations, conflict erupted. Saigo found himself leading a rebellion of disaffected samurai numbering perhaps 25,000. The rebellion sought to restore samurai privileges and return to what the rebels considered proper Japanese values. The imperial army, consisting primarily of peasant conscripts, mobilized massive forces to suppress the rebellion. The fighting lasted from February to September 1877. The Satsuma Rebellion demonstrated conclusively that traditional samurai warfare was obsolete. Saigo's forces, though brave and skilled with traditional weapons, could not overcome the Imperial Army's advantages in numbers, modern weapons, and logistical organization. The rebels won some early victories but were gradually pushed back into Satsuma. The final battle occurred at Shiroyama, where the remaining rebel forces, reduced to a few hundred, made a final charge against Imperial Army positions armed with modern rifles and artillery. Saigo was wounded during this charge and committed seppuku rather than face capture. The rebellion was over. The Satsuma Rebellion marked the end of the samurai as a military force. The conscript army had defeated the supposedly superior warriors, proving that modern military organization and industrial weapons mattered more than individual martial skill or warrior spirit. The romantic ideal of the noble samurai making his final stand against overwhelming odds found its expression in the charge at Shiroyama. But this charge accomplished nothing except to provide a dramatic end to the samurai era. The Meiji government continued its modernization programs, transforming Japan with remarkable speed. Western-style education became universal, teaching not only practical subjects but also creating citizens loyal to the emperor and nation, rather than to local domains or classes. Industry developed rapidly, with government support helping to establish shipbuilding, textiles, mining, and various other modern enterprises. Constitutional government was introduced in 1889, creating a parliament, though one with limited powers and high property requirements for voting rights. Former samurai played important roles in this modernization process. Many became officers in the new military, bringing leadership experience and martial traditions into modern military structures. Others became teachers, police officers, or government officials. The entrepreneurial class that developed modern Japanese industry included numerous former samurai who applied themselves to business with the same dedication they had once devoted to martial training. Some achieved great success, others failed and fell into poverty. The cultural legacy of the samurai began to be romanticized even as the class itself disappeared. The bushido ideology, which had emphasized unconditional loyalty and warrior values, was adapted to support loyalty to the emperor and nation. The government promoted stories of loyal samurai and their noble self-sacrifice as models for modern citizens. The individual samurai warrior, freed from the messy realities of history, became a symbol of Japanese identity and values. The transformation was complete. The samurai class that had ruled Japan for nearly 700 years had been abolished in little more than a decade. Their military function had been assumed by a modern conscript army. Their administrative roles had been taken over by a centralized bureaucracy. Their economic bases had been eliminated. Yet the memory and mythology of the samurai would persist and indeed grow stronger, influencing Japanese culture and identity well into the 20th century and beyond. The abolition of the samurai class in the 1870s did not end the influence of samurai culture on Japanese society and identity. Instead, the memory and mythology of the samurai underwent a complex transformation, being simplified, idealized, and ultimately transformed into a powerful component of modern Japanese nationalism. The legacy of the samurai extended far beyond Japan's shores, influencing Western perceptions of Japanese culture and contributing to both diplomatic misunderstandings and artistic inspiration. The late Meiji period, particularly after Japan's victories in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–5, saw increasing glorification of samurai traditions. These military victories, achieved by Japan's modern armed forces, were nevertheless interpreted through the lens of traditional warrior values. The willingness of Japanese soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender was attributed to the samurai spirit, even though most soldiers were of peasant background with no samurai ancestry. The government actively promoted Bushido as a national ideology rather than a class-specific ethical code. Inazo Nitobe's book Bushido, the Soul of Japan, published in English in 1900, presented Bushido to Western audiences as the equivalent of European chivalry and as the defining characteristic of Japanese national character. Nitobe's work, though influential internationally, actually presented a modernized and somewhat sanitized version of warrior ethics, eliminating aspects that wouldn't appeal to contemporary Western readers while emphasizing honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. The educational system became a primary vehicle for transmitting idealized samurai values to the general population. School textbooks featured stories of loyal samurai who had sacrificed everything for their lords. The 47 Ronin, a group of masterless samurai who avenged their lord's death in 1703 before committing ritual suicide, became perhaps the most famous example of samurai loyalty taught to generations of Japanese students. The story was presented as the ultimate expression of Japanese values, though historical reality was more complicated than the idealized version suggested. Military training in schools incorporated elements of traditional martial arts, particularly kendo, sword fighting with bamboo swords, and judo. These martial arts, modernized and systematized during the Meiji period, were promoted as preserving samurai martial traditions while developing character and physical fitness. Young men practiced these arts as preparation for military service, explicitly linking modern military training with samurai warrior traditions. The increasing militarization of Japanese society in the 1920s and 30s saw even greater emphasis on samurai ideology. The military officers who increasingly dominated Japanese politics in this period frequently invoked samurai traditions to justify their actions and policies. The notion of absolute loyalty to superiors, derived from bushido ideology, was used to demand obedience to military leadership. The samurai's supposed willingness to die without hesitation was held up as a model for soldiers. This militaristic interpretation of samurai culture reached its most extreme and tragic expression during World War II. The kamikaze suicide attacks, named after the divine winds that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, explicitly claimed to embody samurai spirit. Young pilots, most with no samurai ancestry, were told they were following the warrior's way by deliberately crashing their aircraft into enemy ships. The numerous instances of soldiers fighting to the death rather than surrendering were attributed to samurai values, even when the reality often involved coercion by officers who would execute soldiers attempting to surrender. The defeat of Japan in 1945 temporarily discredited militaristic interpretations of samurai culture. The Allied occupation authorities banned teaching of traditional martial arts and censored references to bushido in educational materials, viewing these elements as having contributed to Japanese militarism. For several years, samurai culture seemed to have no place in post-war democratic Japan. However, samurai imagery and values never disappeared entirely and gradually returned in modified forms. The 1950s saw the relaxation of restrictions on martial arts, which were now presented as sports and forms of character education, rather than military training. Films featuring samurai characters became popular both in Japan and internationally, presenting various interpretations of the warrior class from the noble defender of justice to the cynical ronin surviving by his wits. Akira Kurosawa's films, particularly Seven Samurai from 1954, presented complex humanized samurai characters far removed from the superhuman warriors of wartime propaganda. Kurosawa's samurai were skilled fighters but also men with fears, doubts, and flaws. His films influenced not only Japanese cinema but also Western filmmakers, with Seven Samurai being remade as The Magnificent Seven and influencing countless other works. The global fascination with samurai culture that developed from the mid-20th century onward often presented a romanticized and simplified version of samurai history. The image of the lone samurai warrior, bound by an iron code of honor, wielding his legendary sword with superhuman skill, became a powerful cultural icon, particularly in Western popular culture. This image owed more to imagination and cinematic presentation than to historical reality, but it proved remarkably persistent and influential. The martial arts that developed from samurai traditions became global phenomena. Judo became an Olympic sport in 1964. Karate, though not originally a samurai art, became associated with Japanese martial traditions in the Western imagination and spread worldwide. Kendo remained more restricted in its appeal but developed active communities in many countries. These martial arts were practiced not primarily for combat effectiveness, but for physical fitness, discipline, and cultural connection. The Japanese sword achieved almost mythological status in both Japan and abroad. The katana was celebrated as the finest sword ever made, though this claim reflected romantic nationalism more than objective assessment. Nevertheless, the traditional craftsmanship involved in creating a Japanese sword, the aesthetic qualities of the finished weapon, and the rich symbolism associated with the sword ensured continued interest. Traditional swordsmiths, whose craft had nearly died out after the Meiji Restoration, found renewed demand for their work in the 20th century. Contemporary Japan maintains a complex relationship with its samurai heritage. Historical sites associated with famous samurai, castle towns, and battlefields attract numerous tourists, both domestic and international. Museums display samurai armor, weapons, and artwork. Traditional arts associated with the samurai class, including tea ceremony, calligraphy, and flower arrangement, continue to be practiced and valued. Yet modern Japanese society, democratic and pacifist, seems in many ways very distant from the feudal warrior culture of the samurai era. Scholars have worked to present more accurate and nuanced understandings of samurai history, moving beyond both the militaristic propaganda of the 1930s and the romantic mythology of popular culture. This scholarly work has revealed the samurai as complex historical figures whose culture evolved significantly across centuries, who were often motivated by practical concerns rather than abstract ideals, and whose relationship to the ethical codes attributed to them was more complicated than simple adherence to bushido suggested. The influence of samurai culture on Japanese business practices has been noted by various observers, though the extent and nature of this influence remains debated. The emphasis on loyalty to one's company, hierarchical organization structures, and the importance of group harmony over individual advancement have all been attributed to samurai traditions. However, critics note that these features characterize many Asian business cultures, and that attributing them specifically to samurai influence may oversimplify complex social dynamics. The samurai have appeared as characters in countless works across various media novels, films, television series, manga, anime, and video games. These representations range from historically grounded to wildly fantastical, from heroic to critical, from Japanese productions to foreign works. The samurai has become a globally recognized cultural archetype, modified and reinterpreted according to the needs of different stories and different cultural contexts. Western fascination with samurai culture has sometimes involved problematic elements of Orientalism, viewing Japanese culture as exotic and fundamentally different from Western culture in ways that ignore commonalities and oversimplify differences. The samurai has been used as a symbol of inscrutable Eastern ways, of supposedly natural Asian hierarchical thinking, or of mysterious martial arts secrets. These stereotypical representations, while often created with admiration rather than hostility, have contributed to misunderstandings about both historical Japan and contemporary Japanese society. At the same time, samurai culture has inspired legitimate interest in Japanese history, philosophy, and arts. Many individuals drawn initially by romanticized images of samurai have gone on to serious study of Japanese language, history, and culture. The martial arts practiced worldwide have introduced millions of people to aspects of Japanese culture and philosophy, even if filtered through the specific context of martial training. The aesthetic principles associated with samurai culture, particularly those influenced by Zen Buddhism, have influenced art and design far beyond Japan. The emphasis on simplicity, asymmetry, and naturalness has appealed to modernist sensibilities in architecture and design. The meditative quality of traditional arts like tea ceremony has attracted those seeking alternatives to consumer culture and constant digital stimulation. The ethical questions raised by samurai culture remain relevant to contemporary discussions. The tension between loyalty and conscience, between duty and personal morality, between tradition and change, these dilemmas that samurai grappled with in various ways across their history continue to be relevant in different contexts. The samurai example, both the genuine historical complexity and the idealized mythology, provides material for thinking about these enduring questions,